Welcome to the show. Our guests today are Richard Spires, the former CIO of the Homeland Security Department, Frank Konechny, the Chief Technology Officer in the Office of Information Dominance and the CIO in the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force, Kimberly Williams, Chief Strategist for the Public Sector at Informatica, and Andy Batten, Director of the Office of Information Collection at the EPA. It's good to have you all with us today. Our topic today is data security, data privacy, and all the government seems to talk about these days is data, use of data, analyzing data. And of course, recent events have made this whole idea of security and privacy so much more in the national forefront. So why don't we start before we get into the details of the discussion, let's define sensitive data, because I think the definition changes almost from year to year or generation to generation. And why don't we start with Richard Spires? What is sensitive data, and is it depending on the context you're speaking from?
Well, first, good afternoon, Tom. It's great to be here. Regarding sensitive data, I mean, there's certainly are the government definitions, right, that are used for different types of data and the sensitivity of that data. But a more general point, I think, is that in today's world, and government is a great example of this, almost everything we do involves some type of personally identifiable information, right? And the protection of that, and hence the privacy issues that go with that, I think are paramount as we look at systems and we look at protecting data itself.
And would you also say that because of the way we communicate with mobility nowadays, part of that personal information also includes location, something that may not have existed as part of the data sets a generation ago?
Absolutely. And I mean, there's just, it's interesting how we're tracked by about everything we do online today, and mobility is a big factor in that today. Yes.
Okay, and Frank, in the Air Force, there's tactical data, there's logistics data, there's all of the data on airmen and so forth. How do you get your handle around what it is you need to protect?
Well, that's one of the problems that we have. There's so much, if you call it critical unclassified data out there, or information, that it's difficult to actually pinpoint what is and what isn't. And what we've done is establish civil security models against what type of data. And when we get into processing capabilities, there's a set of security that you have to have for each type of data. And the question always for the government, for the Air Force, is what is really PII? Is it your name by itself, or is it your name plus something else? And that has been a critical issue as to when you produce things, what is actually a privacy issue.
So name, rank, serial number is something from an old-fashioned era, I guess, the way you'd look at it now.
Would be considered almost a privacy issue.
Yeah, and what about the health?
The health records are very bad. HIPAA records, even when you talk about having records of the airman when he goes between different bases, all that is very difficult to process. Everything has to be cryptographically, done, encrypted. Has to be all processed correctly. And so a lot of times you find some violations that we would have if you sent, for instance, the question is, do you send your own record or not, or do you send it encrypted and you just have to send it encrypted? So we look for violations in terms of actually seeing records out there in the field that aren't encrypted.
Okay. And Andy, the EPA has another dimension that's personal in the sense that it's proprietary to corporations and business entities that EPA collects. Give us an idea of how the data comes in and what sort of data could be considered private or sensitive from the people that you collect it from.
Certainly the individuals that are going to be reporting the information directly to the agency. We have a co-regulator program with our states and tribes where it's not only EPA that's collecting this information from corporations, but some of this is the delegated responsibility to our co-regulators. So we have the additional challenge of working with states and tribes and territories in ensuring that information about those corporations and maybe the individuals that are sending that information in are also protected.
And so often people can obtain data from the EPA that might be aggregated, but they can't get it from a particular point source that might be part of what ends up being aggregated.
That's true. So, and that's part of what we are really, I think, in the modern era, as we start seeing information being combined, the ability to protect privacy information it really gets its roots in retrieving information maybe about an individual on their name or their address or their rank and serial number. But as you combine that information, you potentially put yourself or try to protect that information. It can be combined and used inadvertently, incorrectly.
And Kimberly Williams, as the chief strategist in the public sector of Informatica, you have a view across all of government. What do you see? What are people worried about with respect to data and privacy, and how are the definitions evolving as you see it?
When you look at data privacy, government as a whole has many challenges. And first of all, it is illegal for that data to be leaked or breached. It is a breach of confidence to the public. They expect their data to be protected. They expect it to be confidential if they share it. And it actually has repercussions for many of the organizations across across government security or national security, or across financial implications across the markets, or financial implications for individuals themselves. So it's imperative that the government really protect that data so that they don't breach any of those things. When you look at what's happening, though, it is, government organizations are struggling. They know they need to protect the data, but oftentimes they don't know where that data resides. And even if they do a complete inventory, most studies find that 20 to 30% of that data still remains hidden, or it's been copied, or it resides in non-production copies as well, and they don't have the security or the procedures in place in order to protect it. And a lot of that comes down to a governance model. They need to understand how to govern their data so that they can protect it, and that's a hard thing to do across an enterprise.
And Richard, when you were in Homeland Security, I imagine data governance must have come up a lot because of how many components make up DHS. How did you approach that whole idea of who's in charge and where is it?
Well, first, let me pick up on what Kimberly was saying. The complexity of what we're dealing with here is so tremendous. And in fact, I think it's one of the big issues that we face in IT security more generally, and of course in data protection, data privacy. It's just the complexity factors. You can't even know what all the end devices are on your network. It's very hard to find that out. So how can you protect all this? And to her point, even understanding where all of this data resides is a big issue. She makes a great point, though, and within DHS, we had a very strong data governance model that we had formed. There was an organization focused specifically around data standards, data governance, and we're really trying to work hard to get our arms around that, because you can bring all the technology that you want to bear, but if you don't have the governance model working right, if you don't have the management structures working correctly, you're not going to get the best out of those tools that you bring to bear.
So good governance covers what? Who can access data? Who can commit data to databases?
What is the authoritative source for that data? Okay. Who can do what to that data, right? Who can access that data under what context? I mean, these are big issues, and obviously in the Homeland Security world and the national defense world, very critically important when you're talking about protecting both the data, but also protecting individual privacy and civil liberties.
And Frank, the Air Force, of course, is a pretty diverse organization in terms of missions and functions and the platforms, and you've got the Cyber Command in there, the Air Force cyber function. So what is the governance approach? What is the architecture approach so that you know where your data is to govern?
The Air Force is taking a more information management approach to it now across the board. We're putting into effect very quickly data tagging for access as well as for discovery. We're setting up an attribute-based access solution to support that, because we realize that we have data everywhere. Mm-hmm. And we want to be able to tag it and control the access at its source, really, because we have data stewards. And the big thing is authoritative data source. Rich mentioned that. We have to get down to the point of having just several selected authoritative data sources that we actually use in all the systems, because most systems now, is probably built upon old technology, which means that they've used data sources that were around that may not be the authoritative data sources. And that leads to several issues with, reliability as well as relevance to the data.
So you're talking about operational information?
Operational information as well as personal information. Because as we progress down the path, you'll see, even for names, if the old systems, remember, you had to enter your name in every system probably. Those are the old HR systems. Depending on what you are, payroll had a different name, and whatever. And that just causes confusion, mass confusion later. That's a simple case. Now look at it from the operational viewpoint. if I put in lat-long coordinates of some enemy, it better be the single authoritative source, because otherwise you're going to screw up the battle management of whatever you're trying to do.
All right, so, and then I imagine there's another complicated layer in terms of governance and data location and data format when you roll up to the Defense Department, of which you're just a part.
Yeah, we're trying to get standard. We're trying to put in NIM standards right now across the board. That's what everybody's trying to do that for DoD. We have a plan in effect to get there within a couple of years at least. They're trying to do the exchange of information correctly, but then you have to look at why you're exchanging information. What is the relevance of the information? What is the purpose of the exchange? And that's probably where DoD is going to be more effective as to determining. We just don't want to release information. It has to be some reason why. Mm-hmm. And we start talking with our foreign partners. We have to make sure that the information is correct for them and that it's probably selected for particular partners that we have.
All right, and Andy, turning to EPA, you've got this multi-tier system in the country because then you have companies collecting and it goes to state agencies and then up to the EPA. How do you approach governance of data and classifying data according to sensitivity when you have that multiple stakeholder, multiple tier levels?
We have our central office, obviously, our CIO, and under the CIO we have our senior agency official for information security, as do all federal agencies. And they have that central responsibility. Obviously, the implementation of that program becomes everybody's responsibility, and that right down to the very user, and that's one of the biggest challenges, not necessarily the biggest vulnerability, but a vulnerability is the end user, our users of this information. They also have to be aware of their responsibilities when they're using information, aware of social media attacks and those types of things that are traditionally things that they didn't have to worry about in the past. So there's really a kind of not only the central CIO's office and their security official, but as you work down to the workforce and then out to our extended co-regulator community, it becomes everybody's responsibility. Okay,
I want to get back to that social media because that has introduced a whole data element in the federal government, and it's official stuff, not just playing around. But before we do that, I want to talk about cloud computing because that's also an initiative that is affecting every federal agency. And Kimberly, why don't we start with you? As agencies move databases and applications and so forth to clouds, especially external clouds, how does that complicate the picture of securing data and understanding what you have and where it is?
At the end of the day, it doesn't matter where the data resides. It has to be protected and it needs to be secured. So whether it's on-premise, it's off-premise, it's on the cloud, it's local, it has to be protected. And interestingly enough, that same level of protection applies to both production and non-production copies as well. So you may have data residing in your production system, and that may be in the cloud that has to be protected, but you also have to be able to protect that in a non-production environment. And oftentimes, I think the resources focus on protecting it in production.
So that would be like the analytical or data warehouse sets that would not be in production but are still real data.
Test copies as well. So you might have a development environment, a QA environment. You may have other non-production environments for reporting. Any of those would be non-production transaction systems, but they are just as capable of being breached. So again, it's not whether it's a cloud environment or whether it's a non-cloud environment. It's any environment has to be protected. Cloud just complicates it because it's yet another copy of that data.
It used to be in IT security and even privacy, it was all about trying to protect the systems, right, and put perimeters around and try to find intrusions and the like. And I think we all know that we're going to get, you're going to get hacked, right? It's just going to happen because, it's very sophisticated today as far as what's going on, and you can't stop it all. So the point about moving to technologies that actually protect the data, okay, wherever it resides and whether it's at rest or in motion, is a very profound and important paradigm shift in the whole area of security and likewise then just privacy. So I think that there are certainly a lot of vendors out there and a lot of movement to how do we do that at scale. in very complex organizations, such as government agencies. And I'm very pleased to see that technology has really come a long way over the last few years to help IT organizations do just that.
Okay, we're going to get to some of those technologies too in the next segment. Frank, in the Air Force, cloud, big issue, especially with test and development environments and the involvement of the Defense Information Systems Agency in the whole cloud picture. How does that complicate your view of the whole data question?
Just like Kimberly said, as long as it's secured in the way we want it to be, it doesn't really matter where it is. And that's what you're going to see for the DISA Cloud Broker, for instance. There's a security model being developed that says if you adhere to all these security controls, which are NIST controls, then you are authorized to process this type of data. And that's what we're going to proceed down to, because we want to be able to use commercial clouds as well as anybody else does. However, security is paramount all the time. And we've looked at not only processing clouds, we looked at large data object clouds, because we have a lot of large data objects laying around, and the processing capabilities, the analytical capabilities involved with them as well. So we're open for anything as long as the data is secured.
All right, and Andy, what about the cloud and its effect on data for EPA? Is it a factor yet for EPA?
It is. I think most recently with our move to a new email system, Office 365, that is housed in the cloud. This has presented challenges for us in making sure that information is secure. I think what we're going to find, it's not just the cloud itself, but the data itself. Traditionally, we talk about protecting that data, marking that data so that we understand what it should be used for, and combining that with access controls so that individuals that have access to that data, we know that that correlation is there, that it's marked appropriately, the individual has appropriate access to that. And that's a very important shift that I think we're going to need to make is better markings of that information that will enable technology to determine if access can be given or not.
And very quickly, the EPA goes back to the late 60s. It's one of the newer federal agencies, but one of the older of the new ones, let's put it that way. And what about all that legacy information? Is that maybe moving to places where you don't need to worry about it day to day in your own environment?
I think we certainly have older data, as do others. We will be, I think, along with other agencies, trying to transform a lot of our records to an electronic format and making it more accessible as needed, and using technology to make it more accessible. But certainly, like many other federal agencies, a lot of our information is probably not electronically available today.
Our guests today are Andy Batten, Director of the Office of Information Collection at the EPA, Kimberly Williams, Chief Strategist for the Public Sector at Informatica, Richard Spires, the former CIO of the Homeland Security Department, and Frank Konechny, the Chief Technology Officer in the Office of Information Dominance and CIO in the Office of the Secretary of the Air Force. I'm Tom Temin. You're listening to the Data Privacy Imperative, Safeguarding Sensitive Data, here on Federal News Radio, 1500 AM.